Hello and welcome to another episode of Disastrous History. This week we're going back to a type of my most popular disaster episode, a tornado outbreak. We're going to cover a little-known outbreak, the 1936 Tupelo-Gainesville outbreak. But it is also kind of a double episode because not only is there a tornado outbreak, there's also a major fire, the Cooper Pants factory fire. Now, since it has been a long time since the last tornado outbreak episode, we will do a little background on tornado formation in case anyone new is out there listening for the first time. If you are, welcome to the podcast. It's been just about a year since our last tornado episode, and I love talking about tornadoes. So if you're not new here, you can go ahead and skip ahead to the actual start of the episode because this will mostly be review. So to start off with here, let's talk about where tornadoes spawn from. For the most part, tornadoes form out of a single-cell storms called supercells. These storms have an ovalish shape because supercells have a spinning center called a mesocyclone, which pushes the tops of the cloud high into the atmosphere and gives it that anvil look frequently called thunderheads. This spinning center is caused by wind shear. Wind shear is winds that are blowing in different directions as you travel up further in the atmosphere, which causes the air mass to begin to rotate. This creates the rotation in the center of the storm, but it also allows the storm to tilt. Supercells need to be tilted backward in order to continue to maintain strength as they have an updraft and a downdraft. And when I mean tilted, I mean it literally. The front of the storm is slightly higher off the ground than the back of the storm. The updraft pulls in warm air in the front of the storm, and the downdraft drops cold air in the rear of the storm. That warm air up in front of the storm is frequently called the warm sector. It consists of warm, moist air that is often pulled up from the Gulf of Mexico on relatively low-level winds called the lower-level jet. This provides significant fuel for the storm to build into a supercell. Because of the separation of the updraft and downdraft, supercell storms can continue on for hours, continuing to cause severe damage and produce multiple tornadoes or one really long track tornado as long as there is warm, moist air in front and the updraft and downdraft do not begin to mix. This area that storms fire up on is one of two options, a dry line or a cold front. A dry line is warm, moist air in front, warm, dry air behind the line. The warm, dry air is denser than the warm, moist air. When they collide, it forces the moist air upward, creating thunderstorms. This typically occurs in the traditional tornado alley, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa. The dry line generally always exists. It moves east during the day, then retreats back west at night, and then back east during the day, and then back west at night. The other way storms like supercells tend to form is along cold fronts. This is much like a dry line, except the leading air on the east side is warm and moist, and the air behind the line is cool and dry. This also forces the warm air upward and creates storm system. This is what produces our tornadoes and supercells throughout the South, like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Now, generally, supercells tend to move from the southwest to the northeast, sometimes west to east, occasionally to the southeast. This is because the prevailing winds in the atmosphere generally move in a west to east fashion most of the time. Supercells are often defined by strong winds, heavy rain, large hail, and the occasional tornado. They don't always have tornadoes, but they produce the most tornadoes out of any storm type. So tornadoes can happen in other types of storms, but they're not nearly as common as when they happen in supercells, for instance. It's much more common to have that supercell structure. So then the question becomes, how does an actual tornado form? Well, we kind of understand, kind of don't. It's complicated and super sciencey, and I'm going to do my best to explain it in plain words here. So as the storm starts to build, it begins to rain. The rain cools some of the air in the spinning mesocyclone, that's the center, and drops it down towards the ground quickly. This is called a rear flank downdraft in the back. It is in the back of the storm, hence the rear flank. Important note here, it's toward the ground, not on the ground. We are still in the atmosphere here. As the mesocyclone hits the base of the storm cloud, the very bottom, it begins to pull in both cold air from the downdraft as well as warm air from the updraft. This begins to rotate around a center point. The updraft portion gets stronger and stronger, and the rear flank downdraft begins to focus the rotation on a smaller and smaller point on the ground. While the updraft is strengthening, it creates a low-pressure area on the ground that starts to pull down the now rapidly spinning, narrowly defined cyclone towards the ground in a condensation funnel. This is a funnel cloud. It then descends towards the ground and becomes a tornado once it connects with the ground. And usually, heavy emphasis on usually, tornadoes produced in supercells tend to move in the same direction as the storm. So if the cell is moving northeast, so is the tornado. If the cell is moving east, so is the tornado. For instance, if it is traveling due east, a tornado may deviate in direction a couple hundred yards north or south, but not usually more than that. The other thing is the vast majority of tornadoes, different sources cite different numbers, but usually about 98 to 99% of tornadoes in the northern hemisphere spin counterclockwise. 1 to 2% of them spin clockwise or anticyclonically. But these are relatively rare and are usually satellite tornadoes off of one major tornado. In about as simple of terms as I can explain it, imagine your left hand is cold air and your right hand is warm air. Between your hands, you have a lump of Play-Doh. You begin to move your hands back and forth to spin the Play-Doh. Eventually, the Play-Doh will elongate and spin down towards the floor in a tornado-like shape. That is essentially how a tornado forms. It is more complicated than that, obviously, but that's the basic understanding of how a tornado forms. Now, technically, tornadoes can happen just about anywhere at almost any time. All 50 states of the United States have had at least one tornado since at least 2000, and yes, that includes Alaska and Hawaii. Actually, Hawaii has had more tornadoes than Alaska, but that's neither here nor there. There is one portion of the country where the vast majority of tornadoes happen. That is a stretch across the center of the country known as Tornado Alley. The arguments about what Tornado Alley consists of is continuing to this day. For the most part, the generally agreed upon range for Tornado Alley is eastern South Dakota, down through eastern Nebraska, over into western Iowa, down through Kansas, Oklahoma, and into Texas. Every year, this area of the country suffers from hundreds of confirmed touchdowns of tornadoes. There has been some discussion that the generally agreed upon tornado had begun to shift east, but the 2024 tornado season kind of put a little damper on that. It was a very active tornado season in the actual traditional Tornado Alley. There's also other tornado alleys in the United States. There's one in Indiana, northern Kentucky, Illinois, Michigan, and western Ohio, most commonly known as Hoosier Alley, one in North and South Carolina known as Carolina Alley, and then one through a small area of New England. And then the one we're going to focus on in today's episode is from Louisiana through Mississippi, Alabama, and into Georgia, known by most people as Dixie Alley. But if you've been a long-time listener of the podcast, I renamed it because Dixie Alley is really boring and named it Waffle House Alley. So we are going to focus on the area known as Waffle House Alley today. And one more thing. The tornado scale is now EF or Enhanced Fujita Scale. And before that, it was just the F scale or Fujita Scale created by Dr. Ted Fujita in 1971. The Enhanced Fujita Scale was not introduced until 2007. You'll note that I said that this was the 1936 Tupelo-Gainesville Tornado Outbreak, which is well before 1971. But thankfully, Dr. Fujita went back through historical records and placed many major tornadoes on the F scale from 1916 to 1992. So, when I give an F rating on this episode, know that it is directly from Dr. Ted Fujita himself. Now, before we get into the actual episode, we need to talk about the situation surrounding 1936, especially in Tupelo, Mississippi. Because if you're familiar with other things happening around the country in the 1930s, you'll know that it was very dusty back in 1930s from the Dust Bowl. 1936 was one of the worst Dust Bowl years. Now, that would be in later on in the summer in July, and we're in April. However, they were still reeling from the Dust Bowls previously in 1934 and one back in 1932. Additionally, it was in the middle of the Great Depression. Now, they were coming out of the Great Depression at this point. However, much of Mississippi was still suffering from the worst years of the Great Depression, 1931, 1932, 1933. They were still in that upward swing from getting out of the worst parts of the Depression. You also have to understand is that there was some weather forecasting available in 1936, but it wasn't great. It was essentially their best guess based on what patterns they could recognize coming up at a certain time. And then in the past, this had happened when this particular thing had happened. There was absolutely no way to predict that there would be a tornado outbreak. There was no way to predict there would be tornadoes at all, period. There was no warning. It was essentially, you have to be able to hear it and see it. Otherwise, there is no idea that this giant wall of Black Death is heading directly for you. And if this episode feels like it's going to come at you without any warning, that's because it's meant to. It's essentially the same way it happened back on that day in April of 1936, that they had no idea what was coming. So, with that being said, on the morning of April 5th, 1936, a cold front began to swing across Arkansas and Texas. By the afternoon of April 5th, storms began to fire up over northeastern Arkansas. The first tornado of the outbreak touched down at around 2 p.m. on April 5th near La Crosse, Arkansas. William H. Gaston and his family were at their homestead just outside of La Crosse. He witnessed the tornado heading right for them and sprinted inside to warn his wife and daughter. But as soon as he made it inside, the home was hit by the tornado and collapsed around him. Gaston would be crushed under the home, his wife would suffer serious injuries, but his daughter would barely make it into the shelter and end up coming out with only a few cuts and scrapes. The family's brand new baby horse was picked up by the tornado and thrown hundreds of yards away and died. This first tornado, an F3 that was on the ground for 6 miles and was about 400 yards wide, would set the stage for the horrors to come when it killed one individual whose home was obliterated. The next tornado touched down in Tennessee later that evening. This F4 tornado was on the ground for nearly 35 miles, causing catastrophic damage throughout Hardin, Wayne, and Lewis counties in central Tennessee. In the mining town of Smith's Branch, 4 people were killed and 27 were injured when 11 of the 13 homes in the small town were completely erased from the map. One family, Pauline and Roy, lived with Pauline's parents, Willie and Sally Mae Pulley. That night, they settled in to go to sleep just as the storm started. The tornado struck their home and ripped it apart. Roy, Pauline, and Willie were all tossed from the home and suffered minor injuries. Sally Mae would not be so lucky. She was struck in the head by a cast iron sewing machine, killing her instantly. Just on the other side of the hill, the tornado then struck the home of Pauline's uncle, Leonard Pulley. Leonard was talking to his sister Sarah when their home was ripped apart around them. Both died when the chimney collapsed on top of them. The next tornado was near Prentiss, Mississippi, about 20 minutes after the Tennessee tornado. This one, also an F3, killed a man by the name of J.O. Robertson, his daughter-in-law, and granddaughter. A few days later, checks bearing his signature were found 150 miles away near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Our next tornado up, just a few minutes after that one, was in Yalobusha, Mississippi. This particular F3 tornado was on the ground for 18 miles and caused 5 deaths in one single home that was ripped apart. Olaf Murphy, his mother-in-law, aunt, wife, and son were all thrown scattered across several acres, killed instantly. But this particular storm was just getting started. This supercell was going to go on to produce a tornado family and spawn one of the most horrific tornadoes in U.S. history. For a quick down and dirty explanation of a tornado family, it is essentially when one single supercell spawns multiple tornadoes. For instance, there is an idea of a skipping tornado or a tornado that has a discontinuous damage path. This can happen a couple ways: the tornado passing over an area where it simply can't cause visible damage, like a cornfield, the tornado weakening to the point where the winds aren't strong enough to cause damage, or the tornado lifting from the surface, then touching back down. The first two, not a tornado family. The last one is a tornado family. So essentially, the tornado picks up and then sets back down, tornado family. If the tornado just can't cause damage because it's not strong enough or there's nothing there to cause damage, not a tornado family. Distinction, maybe not important, but there is a distinction there. Anyway, before we get to that particular tornado, one more F3 tornado spawned near Maury, Tennessee, causing 5 deaths and 30 injuries. One of those deaths was a man named Clovis Carroll, who was pulled out of a boarding house and thrown against a barn that survived the storm. Another was a man by the name G.L. McCurry. He was in the same boarding house. It took a few days to find his body more than a quarter mile from where he was asleep when the tornado struck. If you're keeping track, we are now at 20 deaths in 5 tornadoes in about 6 hours. The next tornado in this outbreak is one that lives in infamy. Tupelo, Mississippi had a population of about 7,500 people on that April 5th day in 1936. It was a relatively charming small town full of mills. Its most recent claim to fame was Machine Gun Kelly had performed his last heist there with a Thompson machine gun in 1932 when he stole $38,000 from Citizens State Bank. Currently, though, the sun was setting. It was getting dark rather quickly. But the heat of the day was not going away as the sun set. It was heavy and humid, and it hung over the city like a wet blanket. In the distance, southwest of town, as the last rays of sunlight were going behind the curvature of the earth, dark, towering black clouds were growing. And among those black clouds, a constant display of lightning. The response by the citizens of Tupelo to the rapidly approaching storm varied greatly, even among family members. Tim Burrow, on South Thomas Street in the southwest portion of Tupelo, viewed the storm with a wary eye. Eventually listening to his son and deciding they should go to his parents' house that was significantly more sturdy than theirs for shelter in case the storm was bad, he drove off. As Tim and his wife and son headed towards his mother's house, they stopped by Tim's brother Jim's house. Jim Burrow lived in the house with his wife Jenny and 11 children, ranging in ages from 20 years old to 2 years old. Tim tried to convince Jim to come with him for shelter, but Jim refused. They would ride out the storm out in their small house, all 13 of them. At a Baptist church in East Tupelo, services were just preparing to end. Sitting in the church pews was a small, poor family. Dad Vernon, Mom Gladys, and a 1.5-year-old boy by the name of Elvis. Yes, Elvis Presley. Lena Price was home alone that night. The approaching storm had filled her with great anxiety as she tried to figure out what she was going to do if worst came to worst. Just before 8 p.m. on April 5th, 1936, an electrical lineman by the name of William Reed was working to repair a damaged telephone line. He could clearly see the approaching storm in the distance. In awe of its sheer power, he stared into the blacker-than-black storm moving closer to him. Then lightning flashed, and he was struck by terror. He could see the tornado on the ground and could see it ripping things out of the ground and launching them upward. Now, I need you guys to picture. You are on top of a telephone pole. It is dark. You can see storm in the distance. You can see the lightning. You are on top of something that very often gets struck by lightning. And you're still there. You're like, I have to finish this job before I can go home. And you get kind of starstruck looking at this storm off in the distance, thinking, wow, that's incredible. As we often do when we go outside and look at storms, seeing all that lightning, all that darkness, all of it, it kind of catches you and you just kind of draw yourself in and you can stand there for 10, 15, 20 minutes just watching the storm roll by, especially when it's out in the open and you can see it off in the distance. Then all of a sudden you have a flash of lightning that illuminates something. Kind of looks like it's on the ground, but that doesn't really make sense because storms are in the air. And then you get another flash of lightning, and you see it again. You're like, what is that? And then there's a flash of lightning again, and it silhouettes the outline of this massive black funnel sticking towards the ground. And as more lightning and as it gets closer, you can see things are flying around in a circle around that tornado. And as it gets closer, you can see trees getting ripped up. Another flash of lightning, you can see a car get sucked up. Another flash of lightning, you see a home disappear. And you, in this case, William, is on top of a telephone pole. Arguably, one of the worst, I'm not even going to argue, arguably, the worst place to be during a tornado. And that's what he sees. Now, William Reed, spoiler alert, did survive this tornado. However, He probably had one of the most terrifying moments of a disaster I think we've ever talked about, because that is the worst. You are several dozen feet up in the air, staring down this monster headed directly for you. One of the deadliest tornadoes in American history was officially on the ground, and it was headed directly for Tupelo, who had zero warning. Throughout all of the personal accounts of this tornado, one thing in particular comes up over and over and over and over again: the noise. Over and over again, people say the sound of the tornado was heard for miles ahead. A low rumble at first, but as it reached the city of Tupelo, it grew louder. As the tornado chewed up and pulverized the small southern city, it created a horrifying noise that terrified everyone. Nearly every home in the way of this massive black wall of death stood no chance. Many of the homes were little more than shacks and were completely swept away. Entire families were killed in an instant. This is Tupelo, Mississippi in 1936. None of these people, the vast majority of these people, do not have very much money. And because they do not have very much money, they are living in what is essentially a wooden shack that is not anchored to the ground in any way. It is just there to protect them from the elements so that they can work and come home and have a place to call their home. There is no engineering. There is no building standards. It is essentially a shed for a huge portion of the town of Tupelo, Mississippi. At the neighborhood on South Thomas Street, where Jim and Tim Burrow had lived with their families, every single home was gone. Completely. There was quite literally nothing left. Jim Burrow, his wife Jenny, and all 11 children were killed, probably instantly. Their bodies were found spread over at least a half-mile area. Photos show where the home once stood. There is no evidence ever that a home even existed on that spot. It was entirely gone. It was just flat grass. There is a dead area where it's dirt. That's it. There is nothing left of the home. No debris. The photo is taken from probably 20 feet back. You can't even see home debris in the photo, even in the background, to either the right or the left side. There is simply nothing. The entire family of 13 was killed in this tornado in their home. The entire family was buried in 13 simple wood coffins in a single mass grave. They dug a grave that was 30 feet by 6 feet, put them all lined up, all 13 of them in a row, and buried them together. The Presleys in the Baptist church were warned of the approaching storm by J.D. Presley. They all piled into Noah Presley's bus and headed to his house in the town of East Tupelo, Mississippi, instead of the small ramshackle house Elvis and his parents lived in. Both of those people are relatives of Elvis. Lena Price heard the roar of the tornado approaching. Thinking quickly, she dumped out the inside of her refrigerator, grabbed her canary, and climbed inside. Her home would be obliterated around her, but both her and her canary would survive inside the refrigerator. Essentially, she pulled an Indiana Jones with an essentially F5 tornado instead of a nuclear bomb. In one portion of Tupelo, Carl Smith was getting his children ready for bed. The whole family was kneeling for their bedtime prayers. In the middle of their prayers, the roof of their home was ripped off. Everyone inside survived with 0 injuries. Lyle Brown, his wife, and his 13-year-old son had a different plan to survive the tornado. They ran out of their house and hung onto a clothesline. As the tornado passed, it picked all of them up and flipped them around, not dissimilar to Joe and Bill and Twister, but they all would survive. Their home was completely obliterated. H.D. McCarter put his wife and 3 kids in his bed and covered them all with a mattress. The tornado picked up their home and moved it 10 feet, but all of them would survive with 0 injuries. A man traveling back to Memphis was traveling through Tupelo, Mississippi, when he saw the tornado headed right towards him. Realizing he couldn't outrun the tornado in his vehicle, he abandoned it and threw himself in a ditch next to the road. As he laid there, he reported he could see parts of houses being blown over his head. When it finally stopped, he crawled out of the ditch to find his vehicle gone. He never found it. Never found the remains of his vehicle. One man found himself in a somehow still standing wardrobe after the storm obliterated the house he was in. He had no recollection as to how he ended up in the wardrobe or how he ended up entirely uninjured. But the destruction of this tornado was only just beginning. As the tornado traveled northeast through Tupelo, it began to reach one neighborhood of Tupelo that was arguably the most at risk: the neighborhoods around Gum Pond. Now, Gum Pond was a 20-acre lake that was about 6 feet deep on average across. All around it, there were a large number of shacks where the working-class African-American community of Tupelo lived. The core of the tornado, the worst part of it, hit Gum Pond dead on. Hundreds of homes were completely obliterated. Entire families with nowhere to go were swept away by the tornado and killed. Dozens upon dozens of people ended up in Gum Pond. There, those who survived the initial tornado were pinned under the water by the debris of all of the homes falling on top of them. For weeks afterward, rescue workers combed Gum Pond in an attempt to find all the victims. Many people believe that they did not manage to find all of them, and the current area in Tupelo where Gum Pond once was is now a park that it probably does, have human remains still buried in it. Dozens more people were thrown completely across Gum Pond and landed in a field across the water. Now, what I need to explain is that Gum Pond was in the center. There were homes ringing the entire outside of this lake, all the way around. The tornado, at this point, about 3/4 of a mile wide, hit all of them. There was nothing left of this neighborhood. And because of the way some of this neighborhood was set up, the tornado picked it up and chucked essentially all of it into the lake. So people were picked up in the lake. Then as they were in the lake, possibly dead, possibly still alive, things like washing machines or wood or roofs or cars or whatever else rained down on top of them. Then several volunteers in the weeks afterward had to go through and pull up those cars, all of that stuff off of the people to try and find the remains of everyone in that lake. And it was a 6-foot deep lake, so many of them drowned, being able to just stand up and float if they hadn't been hit by all of this debris. It is incredibly dark because I can't imagine being picked up by an F5 tornado and then landing in a lake thinking, okay, great. I'm still alive. I've landed in the lake. I can swim to the edge. I can get out. You're going to be, terrified because you just got hit by a massive tornado and ripped out of your home. You don't know where your family is. It is dark. It's the middle of the night, so it's dark. There's lightning everywhere. There's screams all around you because there's other people that are going to survive. You get to the surface after landing in the water. Get to the surface. Start to try and get your bearings and swim towards the edge when a 1930 Chrysler falls out of the sky on top of you, or your neighbor's home falls out of the sky on top of you. You are now pinned under the water. If you survive being hit by it, you are now pinned under the water. And your last thoughts are, I survived being hit by a tornado. I survived being picked up by a tornado and chucked into a lake. I survived being hit by a car falling from the sky, and now I'm going to drown underneath a pond in 6 feet of water. That likely happened to several dozen people at this point. It is a horrifying way to go, arguably up there with burning to death. It is terrifying. After obliterating Tupelo, the tornado moved on, next setting its sights on the small town of Auburn, Mississippi. There, it completely erased many homes and an entire church. One man spent several hours searching for his family after waking up in a field. One by one, he found his dead father-in-law, dead mother-in-law, and finally, dead wife. Still going strong, the tornado next wiped out the town of Eggville, Mississippi, killing multiple people there as well. Next, the tornado hit the outer edge of Shiloh, Mississippi, where a family was ripped out of their homes and gently placed on the ground in the yard, still alive. The tornado continued its catastrophic, destructive rampage, killing several people near Mantachie, Mississippi, and then it killed a 7-year-old boy, as well as several others near Pineville, Mississippi. Crossing the state line from Mississippi into Alabama, the tornado rumbled toward Red Bay, Alabama. In a gas station on the edge of town, the owner, his wife, their employee, and a patron were inside. The tornado picked the gas station up and dropped it back down, killing the patron instantly and injuring the other 3. The owner and his wife carried their employee through the deserted streets of Red Bay in an attempt to make it to a hospital, but he would die the next morning. The tornado would continue on for a while longer before dissipating near Littleville, Alabama. Back in Tupelo, everything was a nightmare. It was fully dark, and hundreds of homes were simply gone. The power was both out because, well, massive tornado, but also had been shut off as a precaution to help prevent fires once the tornado actually hit the city. The Tupelo hospital had been hit by the tornado and was damaged, but was also immediately overwhelmed by the sheer number of injuries in town. Many people had various breaks, fractures, scratches, and impalement injuries. Essentially, any vehicle that was still functioning, buses, hearses, taxis, trucks, personal vehicles, were pressed into service as ambulances to carry injured to hospitals throughout the southern region. The Lyric Theater in downtown Tupelo was turned into essentially a makeshift hospital and operating room where doctors sterilized their surgical equipment in popcorn machines. It also became a makeshift morgue, with the dead being stored in the crawl space until other places could be found to store them. Now, think about that. They have turned this theater, where the residents of Tupelo went to have fun and have a laugh and have enjoyment with the family or with friends or whatever, into a hospital on top, where they had to sterilize their equipment in a popcorn machine that had given out so much fun and tasty food and all of that. And if they failed at their surgery up on the top, they could just take them and stick them below in the crawl space underneath. That is dark. That is some of the darkest thing that you could possibly imagine. On top of all of that, various fires had started in several locations throughout Tupelo, despite the best efforts by the guy running the electricity to turn it all off in an attempt to prevent fires. But these were short-lived, because then torrential rains extinguished most of them and then continued until they left nearly a foot of water in various locations throughout the city, because apparently Tupelo had not suffered enough yet. One of the most enduring examples of the sheer power of the Tupelo tornado was the fact that it took the 50,000-gallon water tower that was anchored to the ground and launched it 3 miles outside of town. Now, the death toll for the Tupelo tornado ranges from 216 to 233 total people killed, but it's highly likely that this is a severe underestimation. Deaths of African Americans in the Gum Pond area were severely underrecorded, if they were even recorded at all, due to racial biases of those in the town and of the time. The entire area of Gum Pond was completely obliterated, with entire families completely wiped out. It's likely that the death toll for this tornado is probably closer to 300. The tornado would retroactively be rated an F5 tornado, causing catastrophic damage throughout several towns in Mississippi and then into Alabama. But unfortunately, the day was not over yet. The supercell that had just produced the Tupelo F5 that had been on the ground for at least 70 miles was rebuilding. It quickly put down yet another tornado, the third of this particular supercell, which would go on to kill several individuals, launching sleeping families from their beds, hurling them hundreds of yards through the air before wrapping them around trees, burying them under debris, and leaving them lying in fields. This would thankfully be the last tornado of April 5th, 1936. Unfortunately, the system was not done yet. The Gulf of Mexico moisture was surging northward in Georgia and would supercharge the atmosphere for April 6, 1936. Early in the morning of April 6, 1936, the air around Georgia was thick. Walking outside, it was oppressive, like trying to swim through soup. The sky was a featureless gray blob. Off to the south and west, it was dark. Lightning could be visibly seen coming ever closer to the city of Gainesville, Georgia. Many in town said they couldn't quite place what was wrong, but that morning just didn't feel right. Everything was just incredibly calm in a way that felt unsettling. Many in town were especially unsettled. Just 33 years earlier, on June 1st, 1903, a massive F4 tornado touched down on the south side of Gainesville. This tornado originally touched down along the train tracks, and many in town had believed it to be a train. They were wrong. Very wrong. This tornado, one of the shortest F4s on record, was only on the ground for 2 minutes. In that 2 minutes, it traveled about 4 miles and killed at least 100 people. Because of this tornado, many of the older folks in town were very wary of this storm rolling in. That morning, Boyd Shaw had gone to work at the Cooper Pants factory in central Gainesville. Her job there was on the second floor sewing various pieces of fabric with about 125 other women. Anna Sexton was also in the Cooper Pants factory that morning. She was working on the second floor as well among all the other young women. It was just another day at work. The weather outside was simply immaterial. The building they were in was built of solid brick. The finger of God could come down from the sky and they would be safe inside. At around 8:20 a.m., Colonel Sandy Beaver was standing at his mirror in his home shaving. All of a sudden he heard what sounded like a plane flying low over Gainesville. Then a few seconds later, it sounded like a fleet of planes, which would have been unusual. Why would they be flying over Gainesville of all places so early in the morning? Trying to figure out what exactly was going on, he turned and looked out the window. There, he saw the beginning of the second incredibly deadly tornado that would strike the South in that 2-day span in April of 1936. From southwest of town, he could see the tornado ripping up trees, homes, and other debris, and it was headed straight for the heart of Gainesville. Elsewhere on the west side of town, William Bryce was also seeing a tornado. This, unfortunately, was not the same tornado Colonel Beaver had seen. This was a different one, traveling due west and absolutely obliterating anything and everything it came in contact with. These tornadoes were on a crash course with each other. In an area just west of Main Square of Gainesville, the two tornadoes merged into one half-a-mile wide, blackened wall of death and destruction. Mrs. C.J. Westbrooks was hosting 4 neighbors at her home that morning. They were all standing about, having a calm and friendly discussion. Suddenly, and with no warning, the home was smacked by the tornado. When it wrenched the walls from the ground, it caused the floor to cave in, dropping all 5 of them in the home into the cellar. All 5 survived the tornado. At the same time, directly across the street, Mrs. J.C. Nash and her 2 children were standing in their living room getting ready for the day. Their home was completely swept away and exploded into a million pieces. But they too fell into the cellar and survived with only minor scrapes and bruises. Down the block, the St. Paul's Methodist Church on Grove Street was picked up as if by a small child playing with a toy a few dozen feet in the air before erupting into a million pieces. The only recognizable part of the church ever found was the back of one of the pianos, and they only knew it was the piano because one of the troublemaker boys of the congregation had carved his name into it. Francis Adams and Dorothy Davenport were sitting in a car near the post office preparing to run some errands for the day, Without warning, the massive twister picked them up in the car and threw them half a block down the street against a statue of Confederate Colonel C.C. Sanders. The car was picked up again and thrown against the First Baptist Church. The tornado then ripped the head off the statue of the traitor and flung it into the middle of the street. Both Francis and Dorothy would be entirely unhurt in the entire event, which, I want to be honest with you, is pretty miraculous. This now massive tornado continued on through downtown Gainesville. Lewis Porter was walking along the street when the tornado that he had somehow completely missed, despite the fact it had been described as the loudest freight train in existence, picked him up and hurled him down the street about 60 yards into a statue dedicated to traitors. He was then picked up again and tossed back to where he had been standing. There, he managed to grab a hold of sewer grates. The tornado then attempted to toss him again, but Lewis held on fast to the grates while his legs were flying in the air, where he was impaled by flying debris. He was then pelted by bricks and wood and then impaled in the side by a flying 2x4. Eventually, the tornado moved on, and he managed to find enough strength to uncover himself and began to crawl down the road. At some point, he stopped, yanked the piece of wood out of his side, and then not long after, some friends found him and carried him to the hospital where he would eventually recover. In the Crescent City ice cream shop, 7 people were inside and saw the tornado coming. They sprinted into the freezer to find shelter from the rapidly approaching twister. Once inside, the building collapsed around them and a massive steel beam blocked the front entrance of the freezer. The rear entrance was locked from the outside. As they debated what to do, an ammonia pipe ruptured and began to leak into the freezer. Fearing suffocating to death, one of the employees grabbed the rear door and literally ripped it from the hinges, allowing all 7 inside to escape. City Commissioner H. Leon Gaines was heading out into his yard to start his car to take his daughter, Kathleen Gaines, to her job as a teacher at the city school. As he did so, he looked up at the sky and saw the tornado heading right for him. He was very familiar with tornadoes because the 33 years prior, that 1903 tornado had obliterated his home. During that tornado, he had found his wife and at the time a 5-day-old daughter lying in bed in a pool of water, scared to death, but alive. This time, unfortunately, he would not be so lucky. He sprinted back into the house and found his wife and daughter in the hallway. He grabbed both of them and laid down on top of them. The tornado obliterated their home around him, picking him up and wrenching his wife and daughter from his grasp. When he came to, he found himself in a small area between the second floor and half of the first floor wall. Crawling out of the debris, he stood up and called for his wife, daughter, and their family cook that they had employed for years. Wandering around the neighborhood, he found his wife first dead. Then he found their longtime cook, Nisi Collier, also dead. And finally, agonizingly, he found his beloved daughter, also dead on the ground. He would be the only member of the family to survive. In one store, the Pruitt Barrett Hardware Company, 8 individuals died when the store collapsed and a cast iron stove ignited the destroyed remains of the building. One man was so consumed by the fire, they only found the remains of one of his legs. But there was one place in Gainesville where the horror was arguably the worst. Back at the Cooper Pants factory. As the tornado bore down on them, Boyd Shaw realized it was headed right for them. All the women around her frantically made a mad dash for the stairwell in an attempt to get to the basement before the massive twister struck the building. Boyd realized she needed to get there too. She tried to get up, but couldn't. She tried to get up a second time, but couldn't. That's when she looked down and saw she had accidentally sewn the clothes she was wearing into the clothes she was making that day. She was stuck. She yanked desperately on the machine to try to escape just as the tornado ripped the roof off the building. Then she was free. Sort of. What had freed her wasn't her desperate struggle, it was the tornado. It ripped her out of her clothes and threw her out of the building against another building across the street. She was relatively unharmed, although now naked. Anna Sexton was also on the second floor of the Cooper Pants factory. She managed to make it to the stairway, but that was as far as she made it before the tornado hit. As she tried to run down the stairs, another woman was picked up by the storm and thrown against her, knocking her down the stairs and trapping her head between the iron railing. She managed to grab a hold of the piece of the stairwell and hold on for dear life while being buried by the collapsing factory. Anna and the rest of the women still trapped in the factory are in a nightmare position. This is a brick building they are now buried in, but it was about to become worse. As Anna was lying there, she began to smell something. Something beyond the dust and blood and dampness of the falling rain. She began to smell smoke. Then it began to get hot. Really, really, really hot. All of a sudden, Anna managed to get a glimpse down. Some of the wood below her feet were burning, and it was peeling the soles of her shoes off. Then, some wood by her face began to burn. It burned for so long, the skin peeled off her face as she lay there trapped. She could hear the crackle of flames and groan of the collapsed building. But then she began to hear other things. Screaming, begging, pleading, praying. Woman after woman, trapped in the debris, began to scream and cry and beg for help as the fire slowly crept towards them before killing them. And there was nothing anyone in Gainesville could do to help many of them. The firehouse in town had also been struck by the tornado, and the fire engine was trapped. The fire became much too large for anyone to get near without suffering certain death. Rescuers simply had to sit and wait for the fire to burn itself out and listen to the horrified screams of the women in the factory as they one by one burnt to death. Anna Sexton was the last person pulled alive from the rubble of the Cooper Pants factory. She had 4 broken ribs, all her hair was burnt off, her feet and legs were burnt, and all the skin had peeled off her face. But she was alive. The exact death toll inside the Cooper Pants factory is unknown. The official death toll is listed as 70, however, that was finalized when there were 40 people were still missing. It's likely that the death toll from this one building was over 100 individuals, making it the highest death toll in a single building from a tornado in U.S. history, by far. Even if the death toll is truly 70, it still holds that terrible distinction. They also don't know exactly what caused the fire that broke out in the Cooper Pants factory. There's a whole host of things it could have been: an electrical short, something hot that was inside that had a hot surface ignition. It's unknown. Fires start a lot of ways in the aftermath of tornadoes. In total, the Gainesville tornado killed an estimated 203 people, but was likely much higher than that. For the first and only time in U.S. history, 2 tornadoes in back-to-back days had killed over 200 people. In fact, no 2 tornadoes in back-to-back days have ever killed more than 100 people. And really, it was all within a time period of about 12 hours. Now, this particular system of storms would produce 2 more tornadoes, one further east in Georgia, killing 1, and one in South Carolina that killed 1 man. On April 9th, 1936, as recovery and reconstruction efforts were rapidly ramping up, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt made a surprise appearance in Gainesville to speak from the train station. He then directed several of his New Deal agencies to the Gainesville area to help with the rebuild. This particular Gainesville tornado would receive an F4 rating by Dr. Ted Fujita during his retrospective analysis of tornadoes. The over 203 people killed in Gainesville, Georgia, still remains the deadliest disaster in Georgia history. In total, the 450 some odd people killed across these entire outbreak is the second deadliest outbreak in American history, behind the 1925 tri-state tornado. In addition, this particular tornado outbreak caused $16 million worth of damage in 1936, which is about $350 million today. This still remains one of the deadliest outbreaks in American history, and one that likely should have remained in the knowledge of America if it hadn't been for, the Great Depression and then the Dust Bowl and then World War II. It still is able to be seen in Gainesville to this day. Now, in the location where the Cooper Pants factory was, at one point they had put up a historical marker to indicate what had happened there. However, that historical marker has since been taken down. In the aftermath of the tornado in Tupelo, Elvis's mother would regularly tell him as he was growing up that they survived that tornado because he was destined to do great things. He would then go on to become known as the King of Rock and Roll, but would also perform at least one concert entirely to raise money for tornado victims in Mississippi in 1975. So, in theory, the Tupelo, Mississippi F5 tornado is the cause of Elvis Presley's career, because that is what spurred his mom to tell him that he was destined for better than what he was currently at. And with that, we've reached the end of this week's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it. As always, you can follow me on all sorts of social medias. It's Disastrous History essentially everywhere. Also, I appreciate you guys. I'm glad that you're still here. Glad you're still listening. And as always, stay safe and remember to check your smoke detector batteries.